Linda is a super big deal in the field. She would be, if you were like a moral psychology hipster, you'd be super impressed with Linda, as I am, because Linda was doing this stuff before all of us jumped on the bandwagon. Linda, I think of you as kind of like the original gangsta when it comes to moral psych work. Like we were all like trying to figure out what to study, and you're like, guys, I've been studying this for a while, and I've already figured most of it out. So it's super lovely to have you here to talk about your work, and yeah, and thanks so much for agreeing to speak and for closing out the summer series. And for format, we sometimes have B-School folks, sometimes have psych folks, so we can go questions during. I can monitor the chat and ask questions halfway, whatever you prefer. So you just tell us.
I am happy to field questions throughout. However, despite us being pretty deep into COVID, my experience on doing online presentations is still kind of minimal. So if you could monitor chat in case I happen to not notice anything. On the other hand, if you have questions and just want to verbally jump in, I'd actually kind of appreciate that, so that I'm not having to monitor the audience as much about when people want to speak. So I'm totally comfortable with being interrupted.
Okay, great. So we will interrupt, and if people want to raise hands, I can also call in folks when I monitor the participants. So great. Take it away, Linda. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Kurt, for inviting me to participate in this. It's always a lot of fun. Doing moral psychology work, even if maybe I've been around as one of the early folks who became interested in it in social psychology, we put the label morality onto a whole bunch of different things. Moral psychology is a really, really broad area, and I think many of us take very different angles on it. Probably because our interest in this area is still, comparatively speaking, pretty new. So, let's see if I can advance screen. There we go. So let me first just kind of try to make or put my own work into context in terms of some of the other things that maybe you've been learning about and having people talk to you about over this summer. Some approaches to morality, and actually the dominant approach to morality for decades, was developmental, and people's interest in how people's developed different kinds of moral reasoning or learn how to morally reason about right and wrong. And so this was really dominated by Kohlberg's theory of moral development for years, which many of you probably learned about in intro psychology courses, with the idea that there were at least 5, maybe 6 stages of moral development that people went through. One that was pre-conventional and more self-interest oriented, one that became more rule-oriented and oriented around conventionality. And then if you became sufficiently evolved, you might develop a post-conventional or autonomous or principled kind of moral reasoning style. Something about this approach to morality, it was that Kohlberg had a theory of moral development about what stages people go through, what those stages were, and so on. And he and his students and other researchers use this theory to go out and make observations about the world to see if people actually reasoned in the ways that his theory predicted. But in this way, morality research really started from this kind of top-down perspective, with theorists defining what they considered to be the moral domain, and then going out and making observations in the world to see if it confirmed or disconfirmed their theories. Morality research really kind of took a turn in around the 2000s. Okay, like the moral development approach predominated moral psychology research from like the 1930s until approximately 2000. And John Green came along and started thinking about deontological versus utilitarian kinds of moral judgments, and what predicted when people would make one or another kind of judgment, using certain kinds of philosophy scenarios, such as the trolley problem, to study how people make tragic trade-offs between, say, saving 5 lives versus one. And at about exactly the same time, Jonathan Haidt came along and wanted to really challenge the idea that morality was about reasoning at all. And again, this was approximately right around 2000. And his thought was actually that morality is grounded in largely in terms of intuitions that have emotional signatures. The chicken is up there largely because part of the way that John tried to establish the morality was really about intuitions and not about reasoning at all. was he would give people scenarios that were generally pretty gross, but harmless, such as, is it wrong to go out and buy a chicken carcass at the grocery store, bring it home, and masturbate with it on Friday night? Now, it's hard to find harm in that particular scenario, but many people are really viscerally react to it and say that it is nonetheless wrong. What's still kind of going on here, though, in these approaches to morality is like Josh Green is starting from philosophical theories of morality about what counts as a moral judgment, and those are trade-offs between utilitarianism and deontological kinds of reasoning. Haidt's work is starting from the notion that people, that morality is really gut level and affectively oriented, and this is getting back to old philosophical debates about the primacy of reason versus emotion. And then completely apart from these kinds of either developmental, philosophically oriented kinds of orientations to moral psychology, we have people in sociology and political science who are studying morality at the level of issues. And what they were interested in is whether people reason about or behave toward different kinds of issues as a function of whether they are moral or not, where social issues were rather arbitrarily defined as moral issues, and issues such as fiscal policy were defined as non-moral issues. This was always being, again, happening at the level of the theorist or researcher who arbitrarily defined some issues as being in the moral realm and other issues as in the non-moral realm, and asking questions about whether there's anything privileged about the moral domain. We could cover a whole bunch of other approaches to morality that are working from similar kinds of theoretical premises, such as evolutionary approaches to morality and so on. All of them are starting with an existing theoretical frame about what should count as morality, right? And something that it always occurred to me anyway, is that each of these approaches seem to assume that everyone sees each of the kinds of issues or concerns that the researcher or theorist wants to study as essentially moral. For example, it's taken as a given that the trolley dilemma is a moral dilemma. Okay, without ever really, morality is a slippery concept. Most of these folks actually don't define what morality is. Okay, it really is kind of like pornography, that everybody's supposed to know what it is when they see it without necessarily having a good a priori definition of what it is. Either that, or else there is such a strong a priori definition of what it is, people are being studied in terms of whether they conform to the researchers or theorists' conception of what is moral. But for example, is a topic like abortion, is it really quintessentially moral? Does everybody see the issue as moral? Same thing as the trolley problem. Does everybody see that as a moral trade-off, or is that kind of like a first grade math problem in terms of which is greater, 1 versus 5? And so the orientation that I've been taking in my research is actually not to a priori define what should or is in the moral domain, and to instead ask what we can learn if we ask rather than assume the degree to which people see something in moral terms. And what this in part allows us to do is to actually empirically try to explore, is there anything different about what people see in moral terms than things that they see in non-moral terms? Is there, are there common denominators of what people see in moral terms versus what they don't see in moral terms, and so on? So the questions that I'm going to try to explore today, oops, I didn't want to advance that fast. And I won't go back. Let's try to go back. Is first the question, is there in fact variance in the degree to which people experience moral convictions about various issues? Or is there largely consensus that some issues are moral and other issues are non-moral? And maybe there's reasons for why they might see some issues as moral and other issues as non-moral. For example, maybe it would be perceptions of harm. Secondly, does this variance in people's attaching moral significance to an attitude domain explain something more or different than people perceiving the attitude to be otherwise as strong? So this is starting more from an attitude perspective than necessarily from existing theories of morality. Where we already know that strong attitudes are better predictors of behavior than non-strong attitudes, and we know something about the characteristics of strong attitudes. For example, stronger attitudes tend to be ones that are more evaluatively extreme, they're more certain, they're perceived as more personally important to people, they're more cognitively accessible, and so on. Is knowing, however, whether people also attach moral significance to that attitude domain above and beyond extremity and importance, is there anything value added to that in terms of our ability to predict people's thoughts, feelings, and behavior? And let's imagine that the answer to that question is yes, that we can discriminate between an otherwise strong attitude and a moral attitude. Third question I want to address is whether measuring moral conviction helps us understand or predict interesting and significant outcomes that we can't explain using other kinds of lenses. And finally, the last question I want to at least be able to briefly dig into today is what leads to attitude moralization? Okay, what leads people to recognize that maybe some attitudes they feel with a force of moral conviction, whereas other attitudes they do not?
Hey, Linda, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
So I noticed in question one, you say experience moral conviction, and then the or part is that there's consensus that some issues are moral and others aren't. And I'm happy just to table this if you get to it, but it seems like those aren't parallel in some sense. So, I can recognize that Chris Hemsworth is very attractive, even if I myself aren't sexually attracted to him in some ways, right? But you can recognize the properties of something without experience.
Okay, and what I'm working with here is really a personal recognition, not a normative recognition. Okay, so are the things that people personally recognize as being morally significant to them, is there consensus about that? Not is there consensus about morality, or what people normatively perceive to be that everybody else tends to see as moral?
I see. Okay.
So, for example, I think that we would, if you ask most people, is abortion a moral issue? I think there'd be probably large consensus that yes, normatively, we in our culture at least tend to see abortion as a moral issue. Do you personally see it as a moral issue, as a separate and distinct question, or possibly a distinct question?
Got it.
Does that help?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
And in fact, we're going to actually use abortion as our example of this. I think that in the United States that there is probably consensus, largely one defined for us by political elites, that abortion is supposed to be a moral issue. However, if moral were really an essential kind, something that's out there and knowable in the world, then we would expect it to actually be knowable across time, cultures, and so on, right? Well, it turns out that historically, even in the United States, where abortion is normally generally considered to be moral, it wasn't always moral. Okay, up until about the 1860s, abortion practices were openly advertised in newspapers. If you can read in the cover of this book, you can actually see some of these ads. They might not literally use the word abortion, but they were widely understood that that's what the services that were being offered by midwives and homeopaths. And this was very non-controversial. Okay, it just was not a point of discussion. The point that you might actually abort a fetus up until the point of quickening was even seen as biblically appropriate. And it wasn't until actually increasingly male physicians wanted to start licensing their services and wanted to get rid of competition from midwives and homeopaths that laws started becoming involved in terms of legal practices, and where abortion started to get this kind of only certain people should be allowed to practice it, or it should not be practiced at all, and so on. So it really only started around the 1860s. So from the early colonization of America in the 1600s up into the 1800s, this was completely non-controversial and non-moralized at all. It lapsed in terms of the degree to which it was really moralized for a good long time, and it really started to emerge again as a moral topic in the 1970s. So there's been the ebbing and waning of the degree to which even something that we normatively see as at least in contemporary terms, as a moral issue in America. It hasn't always been the case. Nor is on the idea that abortion is a moral issue cross-cultural universal. For example, in China, abortion is as widely accepted as any other form of birth control. Same is true as many other countries. The United States actually tends to be rather unique in the degree to which it moralizes abortion above and beyond any other kind of birth control practice. And perceptions of the morality or acceptability or moral acceptability or impermissibility of different kinds of actions actually changes considerably over even relatively short periods of time, such as between 2001 and 2015. The moral acceptability of gay or lesbian relations has changed by 23 percentage points. Having a baby out of marriage or out of wedlock is changed by 16 percentage points, and so on. And it doesn't always move in the direction of things becoming more morally acceptable. Some things have become more morally unacceptable, such as medical testing on animals. So there's considerable variability in the degree to which people see certain issues and as morally acceptable or unacceptable. And that's measuring people's degree to which they report that their positions on various issues as a reflection of their, meaning their own core moral beliefs and convictions for more than 20 years now. And what we always find is a near normal distribution. Okay, there's going to be some positive skew on some of the issues that we investigate, such as abortion. But on the other hand, what you can see here, and this is very typical, is that the mean degree of moral conviction on abortion in the United States sample is around 3. And there's considerable variability around that point. You know, and there's some issues that you can pick up that maybe fewer people see moral convictions about, and some that you see more. But on the whole, we always find variability in the degree to which people report that their position on any given issue is a reflection of their personal moral beliefs and convictions. And that includes trolley problems, by the way. Trolley problems are actually a little bit lower on average than, say, abortion, and the degree to which people see it as the issue that they're trying to resolve there as a reflection of their personal moral beliefs and convictions, or that there's a moral stake in that issue. So I'm hoping by this I'm convincing you that perceptions of moral conviction vary. Okay, even the same attitude object can, at different historical points in time, might vary in the degree to which it's normatively seen as moral, and certainly there's a considerable degree in the degree to which anybody's or people report that they see any of these given issues as necessarily in a moral light. But that's a separate question from the ideas: is this variability really important? Is it explaining something that we didn't already know, based on, for example, knowing that a given attitude is evaluatively extreme, important, certain, or so on? And so the question is, are moralized attitudes different from strong but non-moral attitudes? Okay, is it just valence and strength, or affective intensity, or something along those lines? For example, I did my undergraduate work at the University of Michigan, and Michigan fans they feel very strong about their sports team. Okay, their identity as a Michigander is generally important to them. They're valued extreme. They're certain about it, and so on. But is that necessarily the same thing as how they might feel about a topic like abortion, especially if they have a strong but otherwise moralized belief about abortion? And we have some working theory about how this might work, and this is built on Turiel's domain theory of judgment, which might also apply to attitudes. And that is that attitudes might vary not only in terms of structural features such as strength, but also in terms of kind. For example, some attitudes really might reflect preferences. These might be matters of taste. I might simply prefer, for example, that abortion be legal so that I can have a backstop birth control method should everything else fail, because for whatever reason, I'm not in a position to have children. Okay. If I have a preferential position on abortion, odds are I'm going to be pretty tolerant if you don't happen to share my particular taste or preference in that particular domain. Okay, you can think about preferences also as being things like your preference for chocolate versus butterscotch. Some people have very strong preferences for one over the other, but it's okay. I can be friends with you if we don't happen to share the same preference for one of those two flavors. So attitudes that are preferential are usually reflections of matters of taste that are perceived to be as subjective, and that people are very tolerant of people who don't necessarily share them. A lot of other attitudes are actually rooted in conventions, okay? And these are conventional beliefs about, we can even use the words right and wrong. For example, it's conventionally right in the United States to drive on the right-hand side of the street. Although it'd be wrong to do otherwise, but we understand that this is just a normative standard or coordination rule. Okay, it's okay if people in other countries, for example, do the reverse, so long as everybody understands that the reverse rule is the coordination rule. If I had a conventional position on abortion, it might be that, hey, people in my faith community happen to have this particular belief about this practice. Because I'm a member of that faith community, I embrace that practice. However, if my faith community or the faith community authorities were to change their position on it, odds are I would update that belief as well. Okay, attitudes that are rooted in normative, more norms or conventions are often codified by law, or rules or ethical guidelines for workplaces and things like that, but they're group specific and narrow. This is what people in my group tend to believe. And it's okay if people in other groups, in other settings, for example, have different rules or different beliefs about what's right or wrong in that context. Attitudes, however, that reflect people's perceived moral imperatives, however, have a number of features that differentiate them from preferences or conventions, or at least they theoretically do. They tend to be seen as more absolute and universally true. This is as it should be not only in my group, but in your group as well. This is seen as akin to facts. Okay, the idea that if you have a moral conviction that abortion is wrong, for example, that is true to you probably as 1 + 1 = 2. It's just obviously wrong, and actually having to explain to somebody else may feel really bizarre. Like, how do you not understand that this is wrong? It also tends to be independent of authorities. That if authorities were to reverse their position, for example, the Supreme Court rule that abortion is legal in the United States when you have a moral imperative against it, you're not going to go along with what that authority has to say about the matter. And we have lots of evidence of that in the US. It has ties with strong emotions as a general rule. People feel stronger senses of obligations about things that they have moral convictions about, that if I feel a strong moral conviction about X, I am therefore obligated to take certain kinds of actions in the name of X. And these are more resistant to change than otherwise strong but non-moral attitudes, and similarly resistant to compromise. Okay, but I want to say a priori that these are hypotheses. These are not definitional characteristics. It's, at least the way that we've been approaching this is like, these are possible ways that moral attitudes might differ from attitudes rooted in convention and preferences, but they're testable hypotheses, not how we're operationalizing moral conviction. So some of our first studies on this actually went to study the degree to which people were in fact intolerant of those who did not share their moral convictions. We asked people, for example, to nominate what is the most important problem facing the country today. This was trying to hold importance constant, but we nonetheless measured dimensions of attitude strength in order to control for them. So we measured how evaluatively extreme people's position were on this issue, how personally important it was, how central they saw it to their identity, as well as the degree to which they perceived the issue as a moral conviction. We use very face valid items in order to capture moral conviction. For example, such as how much are your feelings about X connected to your core moral beliefs about right? Core moral beliefs and convictions. We also use items such as connected to your fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. We try to keep these very face valid and narrow so as not to confound our measure with moral conviction with things that it theoretically should predict it, such as things like beliefs about harm, right? And then to measure social intolerance, we used an old-fashioned prejudice measure. It's a social distance measure that is usually used with racial minorities as a target, but in this case, we use people who do not agree with you with your views on this particular topic. So I would be happy or unhappy to have someone who did not share my views on this issue as someone who married into my family, the owner of a store I might frequent, someone who might move into my neighborhood, teacher of my children, and so on. Okay, in a first study studying this, we found controlling for gender and age in the first step, controlling for attitude, extremity, and importance and centrality in the second step. We nonetheless found that moral conviction explained unique variance in the preferred social distance people would like to have from an attitudinally dissimilar other, okay, in that same domain. If you don't agree with me about my most important issue, I don't want you to marry into my family. And that's something that's above and beyond how extreme I feel about this or how important this issue is to me. We put this to a stronger test. In a second study, sorry, the slide looks like a repeat, but what we did is instead of asking people about the most important issue, we asked them about 4 issues that we just chose: abortion, legalized abortion, whether capital punishment should be continued in the United States, legalization of recreational marijuana, and building new nuclear power plants in the United States. And we introduced some additional controls just to try to rule out some alternative explanations, including strength of political orientation and generalized moral conviction. And this variable, what we used is, for example, to predict social distance towards somebody who didn't agree with you on abortion. We used the average of your moral convictions on nuclear power, marijuana, and capital punishment. Because we know that some people just tend to see things all in a moralized light, and maybe those people don't like anybody, right? So we use that as a control as well. And it turns out that people who tend to see everything in a moralized light do prefer greater social distance from people who don't agree with them about all kinds of things, at least 3 out of the 4 issues that we studied. But we control for that. And then we also control for extremity, importance, and certainty. And you can see that extremity predicts social distance, but then importance and certainty are kind of wacky. They're going all over the place. Nonetheless, even when controlling for these alternative possibilities for what might explain preferred social distance from attitudinally dissimilar others, we nonetheless found robust effects for moral conviction. That the more morally convicted you were about abortion, capital punishment, legalizing marijuana, building nuclear power plants, and so on, the more social distance you preferred between yourself and someone who disagreed with you about those issues. You just don't want them to move into your neighborhood.
Linda, I was wondering if you could tell us what the general correlation is between the kind of importance, extremity, certainty, and conviction. Are they super different, or?
It varies across issues. Probably we get the most reliable and strong correlations between extremity and moral conviction, value of extremity. But the correlations generally don't exceed around 0.6. And then, but more important than that, using extremity as a predictor, separate from moral conviction, we find very different patterns of results.
Interesting.
Okay, so these things are correlated concepts, but not redundant ones. And again, the downstream consequences of measures of them tend not to be the same. And I'll be getting to that more persuasively in a study here shortly.
Great.
But great question. Now, this was all fine and good, but it's all self-report in terms of social distance. And so we wanted to do something behavioral. Will the degree to which people have moral convictions about things lead to, for example, greater physical distance from people who don't disagree with you? And so in this study, what we did is we brought people into the lab and told them that they were going to be engaging in a get to know you exercise. And what we wanted to know is whether having inside information about somebody else before you engage in this exercise mattered. For example, maybe you followed them on Twitter, or you followed them, you heard some gossip about them, and will that influence how you then get to know them in this exercise? All participants were told that they were going to be in the informed partner in the experiment, that they already would know something about who they were about to meet. They figuratively drew some information out of a hat that we told them we had collected from mass testing at the beginning of the semester. And they all learned that who they were going to meet was very strongly pro-choice on the issue of abortion. Okay. They're then ushered into another room, and where they see a chair with a backpack on it. There was actually a sweater draped across the back of the chair and a coffee cup. Just a kind of little extra prime. We had a pro-choice button on the backpack. But there's a single chair, and then there's a pile of chairs in the corner, and no place for the person to specifically sit down. And we said, oh my, the other participant must have wandered off to find the bathroom or something. Why don't you just grab a chair from that corner, sit down? I will go try to find the other participant. You know this building, they're probably lost, they'll never find their way back to the lab. As a couple of you who have visited my building, such as Frank, might know, this is a very plausible cover story, given it's built on a theory of rotating squares, and it's really weird. Okay, it's a very weird building to get around in. So the experimenter would leave for a couple of minutes, come back, and then say, let's study over, and would measure the distance between two facing chair legs to get a measure of physical distance between the real participant and who they thought they were going to meet. And what we found is that people sat higher in moral conviction sat closer to someone who had a similar attitude on abortion as they did, okay, than did those who were lower in moral conviction on the issue. Whereas people higher in moral conviction also sat further away from someone who had a dissimilar attitude on abortion than those did with lower moral conviction. And the effect of repulsion for attitude dissimilarity was stronger than the effect of attraction for attitude similarity in this particular study. Moreover, these results were robust to controlling for attitude strength controls. So in other words, the degree of repulsion that we feel towards people who don't share our moral convictions translates not only to our self-reported attitudes, but also our behavior in the lab. This has been subsequently replicated using a slightly different share paradigm by other researchers as well. But here's the study that I think that's going to address Kurt's question really about the distinction between moral convictions and strong attitudes most persuasively. And this is a study that was also more interpersonally interactive, where we brought people into the lab to study whether moral convictions pose a barrier to resolution of conflicts. This is a really complicated study, so let me walk you through it. We explored people's behavior in small, attitudinally homogeneous or heterogeneous groups. Okay, meaning everybody in the group had the same attitude on the issue that they were going to talk, or two people have one position on the attitude, two people have the opposite attitude on the issue. What the task was to generate a procedure that could be used to once and for all resolve an assigned issue. Okay, emphasis on procedure. Okay, we're going to have to come up with a procedure that for once and for all will decide whether, for example, abortion is going to be legalized in the United States, whether capital punishment was going to be allowed in the United States, or there was going to be mandatory testing as a graduation requirement. Those issues were chosen because it turns out that people's attitudes and moral convictions on abortion and capital punishment do not tend to correlate, despite them both being pro-life issues. If you tend to be pro-life on the position of abortion, you tend to be not pro-life on the issue of capital punishment. So it was easy for us to find approximately equal number of participants who were already morally convicted about abortion or morally convicted about capital punishment, but not the other thing. Okay? So everybody was selected for the study to have a moral conviction about abortion or capital punishment. And they were either assigned to talk about what they were morally convicted about, abortion or capital punishment, what they weren't morally convicted about, capital punishment or mandatory testing as a graduation requirement. Nobody in our subject pool, or very, very few people, were morally convicted about mandatory testing as a graduation requirement, but our students feel very strongly about it. Okay, either very pro or very con. So it's an attitude strength control group. No moral conviction involved there. Okay, and again, their task was to decide once and for all whether we should implement policies that would make abortion legal or illegal, make capital punishment, ban it or not in the United States, or implement mandatory testing as a graduation requirement. There were three possible group outcomes to the group discussion. They could come to unanimous consensus on a procedure. Anytime that the group felt that they were ready to take a vote, we had a little card that they could actually unanimously, anonymously complete their vote, knock on the door, have the experimenter come and tally the votes. Also on that sheet, there was an option for them to say, I vote that we're never going to be able to agree on a procedural solution for this. Okay, and we call that the group would hang. When they came to unanimous agreement that they couldn't agree, it was like a hung jury. Or they could time out. We gave them 30 minutes, which in laboratory time is an eternity, to try to resolve this issue. If they weren't done by 30 minutes, we shut things down. We also asked participants to complete surveys after they were done with their discussion. Some of those results I'm going to be reporting here. We also had third-party judges view videotapes of the discussions. And what you can see here is that people in heterogeneous groups that talked about something they had a moral conviction about, which we also call as a moral mandate, reported the least goodwill towards each other. They disliked their group members more than participants in any other group configuration. How much they reported trying to cooperate in terms of trying to come to a solution to their problem. Again, participants in those heterogeneous groups that were discussing something they had a moral conviction about were the least cooperative. Whereas, and this one's really interesting, the participants in the heterogeneous groups that talked about something they had a strong attitude about, but not a moral conviction, were the most cooperative. Okay, these tend to be the people that were in the mandatory testing as a graduation requirement group. These were third-party ratings of how tense the group perceived, okay, videotape ratings. Again, those who are in the heterogeneous attitude group, excuse my visitor. who talked about something that they were morally mandated about, were perceived by third-party perceivers, blind to condition, as the most tense, and that strong attitude group were seen as the least tense. Similar pattern for defensiveness. And then finally, we have whether they were able to come to resolution about their issue. This is the only result where group heterogeneity or homogeneity did not matter. Okay, groups who talked about something that they were morally convicted about were the least likely to be able to come to agreement about a procedure to solve their particular assigned issue. Whereas those in the strong attitude groups and the who talked about something they weren't morally mandated about were much more easily or more likely to do it. Now, these results are particularly finding and striking, particularly the contrast between the strong attitude and the moral mandated groups in terms across the entire study. Something that was really apparent to us in terms of watching the videotapes of the discussion, those who were talking in the strong attitude group were having a blast. Okay, they disagreed with each other about whether we should have mandatory testing as a graduation requirement, but they were having a lot of fun talking about it. Those who were in heterogeneous groups talking about something they had strong moral conviction about were tense. Okay, these were awkward conversations. They tiptoed around each other like crazy. In every other group configuration, people outed what their actual preferred outcome was within the first minute. They waited forever in the heterogeneously morally mandated groups to actually disclose what the preferred outcomes were. People were 100% blind to their assigned conditions. They didn't know that they were in attitudinally heterogeneous or heterogeneous groups. They didn't know about anybody's pre-existing attitudes, but somehow they knew that the conversation was a more dangerous and difficult one in the groups where they all had moral convictions about it, but had different perspectives on it. The contrast between that and the strong attitude groups couldn't be more strong. This really suggests there really is something about moral convictions that are important and different than strong attitudes. So I would argue, is moral conviction distinguishable from attitude strength? I would argue yes. And I think the strongest evidence comes from that group study that I just reviewed. Does moral conviction help us understand interesting and significant outcomes? One study that we did that was attempting to explore this was testing that authority independence hypothesis as one way that moral convictions theoretically differ from non-moral convictions, and that is that we don't care as much about what authorities have to say about things. We used the Supreme Court decision to study this issue, a naturally occurring experiment that we knew the Supreme Court's calendar well enough in advance to be able to get measures in the field. We measured the perceived legitimacy, degree of trust, and procedural fairness of the Supreme Court well before they heard a particular case, which in this case covered physician-assisted suicide and whether states were allowed to ban it. We measured participants' support and opposition of physician suicide, the degree to which their positions were moral convictions, and also the degree to which their position on physician-assisted suicide was a religious conviction. We waited around for the Supreme Court to actually make its ruling in the case. In this case, the case was called Gonzalez v. Oregon. It ruled in favor of states' rights ability to legalize physician-assisted suicide. And then we asked the same, by the way, this is a large nationally representative sample. We asked the same questions about legitimacy, trust, procedural fairness, as well as how fair they thought the outcome was and the degree to which they accepted the Supreme Court's decision as binding. Just to orient you towards this graph, on the y-axis, what this graph is explaining is unique variance explained by these variables. As you can see, the strength of religious conviction people had about physician-assisted suicide explained about 8% unique variance of how fair people saw the Supreme Court decision and the willingness to accept it as binding. Almost everybody who had a religious conviction about physician-assisted suicide opposed legalization, and so they saw this as unfair and did not accept it as binding. The blue lines are people's moral convictions. Keep in mind, this unique variance explained. This is variance that's not explained by religious conviction. And this is actually reflecting the effect size for in interaction terms, in terms of people's support by their moral convictions. People who supported the legalization of physician-assisted suicide, thought it was fair and final, given the court ruled in their favor, and thought it was unfair and not final if it ruled against their moral convictions. What's interesting from those of you who are interested in theories of procedural fairness is that pre-ruling perceptions of legitimacy, trust, and so on, did not explain any unique variance in people's perceived fairness of the outcome or their willingness to accept it as binding. Nor were there any interactive effects in terms of qualifications of how fair the procedures were on the effects of moral conviction. We also measure the degree to which people's perceptions of the Supreme Court changed as a function of whether it ruled consistently or inconsistently with people's moral convictions or religious convictions. Now, it turned out that religiously convicted did not hold a grudge against the Supreme Court. Although they really objected to the Supreme Court's decision, there was no significant change in the perceived procedural fairness of the court, its legitimacy, or their trust of the court from pre to post decision. Not the same thing was true for moral conviction. People's support or perceived procedural fairness, legitimacy, or trust in the court rose or fell as a function of whether it ruled consistently with people's moral convictions in the case. I should say that we've replicated the Supreme Court study now in other domains, particularly the more recent Supreme Court decisions around the whether same-sex marriage should be allowed, and found an exact replication of these results. We were also interested in whether moral convictions might predict political activism and willingness to get engaged in different kinds of issues. And particularly in this case around the issue of the same-sex marriage debate. I'll get back to the method before getting into this. We collected data from states where same-sex marriage had already been legalized and where it had not before the federal court had ruled on it. And we had approximately equal numbers of supporters and opposers in those states. And we measured the degree of moral conviction about it and their willingness to get engaged in activism efforts, as well as several mediators of what might predict them to become engaged, including we were particularly open in terms of, or interested in approach-oriented motivations. Were you trying to create your preferred universe in terms of becoming politically engaged around the issue of same-sex marriage, or were you trying to avoid whatever you saw as the bad outcome in this case? Now, we found no effects for status quo effect, whether it was legal or illegal in the participant states. We found no differences as a function of whether people were fighting to overturn the status quo or maintain the status quo, and so on. What we did find is that moral conviction did predict increased intentions to engage in activism, but perceived harm was not one of the mediators of that effect. People were not trying to avoid their dystopian future. Instead, they were trying to achieve the benefits of their preferred future, and they were trying to minimize their personal regrets about failing to become involved, and were trying to maximize the pride they would feel if they did become involved. We then replicated this study using a completely different issue, that is conceal and carry on college campuses, and found exactly the same pattern of results, that people's morally convicted activist intentions were driven primarily by the benefits of their preferred outcomes, anticipated regrets about failing to become involved, and anticipated pride about becoming involved. So these studies are examples of ones that I think demonstrate that does moral variability in moral conviction predict important outcomes? And I would argue yes. It predicts people's reactions to authorities' decisions. It predicts their willingness to become politically engaged in different kinds of issues, and we're starting to get some insight into the processes that might lead to those effects. We've recently written a annual review chapter that covers a whole bunch of other outcomes that moral convictions have as well, including increased tolerance for violence to achieve preferred outcomes and a host of other things as well. And I can briefly try to also cover what were preliminary studies in terms of what is we think is leading to advocacy motivation. Okay, it's one thing to say, okay, moral convictions have consequences, but how do people become morally convicted in the first place? Now, we did a whole bunch of studies, initial studies trying to study this in terms of maybe it was just arousal. Okay, and so we did misattribution of arousal studies by, for example, collecting people's moral convictions about things, either while they were waiting in line to go to the top of the Willis Tower here in Chicago, or let's say we're up at the top of the tower and out on this crazy observation deck where you can look down and see, you know, like practically a mile down. It was very scary and very arousing. We found no effects for these kinds of arousal, either in field studies like this or in the lab where we had people jump rope and wait a little bit and then give their ratings. So maybe incidental arousal is not doing such a good job in terms of leading people to moralize. But then we tried, because it was cool at the time, to do all kinds of disgust work. We tried asking about people's moral convictions using dirty lab kinds of environments, having people up to their elbows in gummy worms and Elmer's glue that was really gross versus control condition of something very pleasant. All kinds of things like this. We found no effects for incidental disgust and satiations, anger, fear, a whole bunch of things on people's moral convictions. So incidental emotions don't seem to be something that's involved in how people become morally convicted. So this really led us to rethink things quite a bit. And in particular, what it led us to rethink is maybe the emotions people attach to things that they're morally convicted about are going to trump incidental emotions in terms of driving their emotional reactions to, or what leads to increased moralization. I'm going to skip through some particulars because we're running late in time and I want to add more time for questions. But just know that we expose people either at subliminal or superliminal levels of awareness to images that depicted animal rights violations, really bloody animal carcasses. We had pure disgust, which was things like overflowing toilets and that sort of thing, versus pictures of aborted fetuses. Like, we really have fun in our lab, versus control images that had none of these things. We got no effects that these things were at subliminal levels of awareness, meaning that in order to change moral convictions, you have to have some conscious awareness of what you're being exposed to. And the only thing that changed people's moral conviction relative to control was being exposed. This was the target attitude was people's moral convictions about abortion. They increased only after being exposed to pictures about aborted fetuses and not to pure disgust items or animal rights violations. These results are inconsistent with the idea that morality is intuitive for a couple of reasons. That moralization required some cognitive awareness to what you're being exposed to, and because incidental disgust did not have a moralization effect, despite pre-testing finding out that it was equally strong as our integral forms of disgust, which is disgust and satiations related to abortion. We did a replication to explore the role of harm might be playing in this. So we had IF's depictions of harm where, for example, nails are going through hands and stuff like that. And this was harm also to a human target. Still only the abortion, the fetuses were the ones that increased moral conviction relative to control. We did some mediational analyses to look at mechanism. Harm did not explain increases in moral conviction. Anger didn't, but perceived disgust did. We subsequently did other studies that indicate that other emotions besides disgust can predict moralization, in particular in the context of predicting people's attitudes over an election cycle. Moral convictions increase over the cycle to the extent that you're about moral convictions about your preferred and non-preferred candidates will increase. If your enthusiasm for your preferred candidate starts to increase, so too will your moral convictions. As your hostility increases towards your non-preferred candidate, so too will your moral convictions against your non-preferred candidate. Fear and threat don't do the same thing. And changes in perceived harm or benefits of electing your preferred candidate don't lead to changes in moral conviction, but they are consequences of changes in moral conviction over time. So I just want to skip ahead, given we're running late on time. To the animating questions that I started at the beginning of our talk, and that is there variance in the degree to which people experience moral convictions about issues? I hope I persuaded that yes, there is. Tim Ryan, who I believe is in this audience, has also some very persuasive evidence to this respect. Does this variance explain something more than indices of attitude strength? I would say the answer is also yes. Does moral conviction help us understand and predict politically relevant outcomes? Yes. And to the extent that we're getting some handle on what leads people to moralize their attitudes, so far the answer appears to be integral emotions. And that is specifically emotions that are explicitly tied to the attitude object, not incidental emotions. Okay, so this is like the degree of enthusiasm you felt about your preferred candidate, for example, predicted increased moralization of your preferred candidate, but does not predict anything about your non-preferred candidate. It's only the emotions about your non-preferred candidate that changes the emotion or the moral conviction about your non-preferred candidate. So it's a very specific emotional reaction to the attitude object. And I want to close there just to allow some opportunity for discussion and questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Linda. Any questions? All right, we got some in the chat. We can read them. Curtis says, how much do you think whether people experience their moral stances of objective and universal versus opinions varies across context? For example, perhaps people call their moral beliefs objective when they're trying to mobilize people to act, and opinions where they're talking with each other and trying to get along.
That's a great question. That's a really good question. It's not an experiment that we have done. However, we have done some work where we ask people to nominate things that they perceive themselves as facts, attitudes that are written facts versus convention versus moral convictions. And what we find is that there's no difference in how factual people perceive their own self-nominated facts and moral convictions. And there's no difference in terms of how universally true they perceive those things to be, how objectively true those things tend to be, and so on. So it's the only evidence I really have that can directly speak to that. But as a communication goal, I think that that's a really interesting question. And whether people will also be able to try to moderate their perceptions of that, or at least their expressions of how objectively true they see these things to be when they're actually interacting with others that are attempting to persuade. I hope that's answering the question.
Yeah, interesting, right? Going to Thanksgiving with your moral mandates ready to blow up the turkey dinner. Abby, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's like kind of almost exactly what Chris just put in the chat, but looking at the patterns surrounding abortion and capital punishment regarding like pro-life kind of views, it does suggest that there is maybe elite influence on moralization, even if once an attitude is morally convicted, it doesn't matter. And I was just wondering if you would think that's something that could be at play. For instance, after Obama supported gay marriage, and I think it was like 2009, would liberals maybe then go and moralize that attitude and then become authority and dependent on that in a way that they hadn't previously, kind of suggesting that the causal arrow with elite influence could go the other way as well if an attitude is not yet moralized.
Right, that's especially interesting question in like, especially the Trump era. I'm watching, for example, some folks' position on particularly Russia completely flip over. It was kind of mind blowing to watch those attitudes flip. Most of our research indicates that authorities are not having a very strong influence, at least from the lines of like, okay, Supreme Court, for example, is that leading to coattail effects, for example, on people's acceptance of same-sex marriage? That we haven't found. But what we haven't really studied is more, the Supreme Court isn't probably the most symbolic of in-group membership or in-group loyalty compared to, for example, our political candidates. And it would be interesting to actually do a longitudinal study to see that if people's moral convictions do become stronger about particular issues as elites articulate their positions on those issues. And I honestly don't know. We do know that people's attitudes about people running for office do become more morally convicted over time, but what we haven't been able to do is predict exactly why, you know, at least on an attitude stance. We do know it's about emotions, but we don't know about emotions about any particular issue. So I'd love to see somebody do that kind of research.
So Anne, whose mic is broken, asks, do you think these findings relate to the idea that there's a zero-sum game that seems to be present in political and moral attitudes? So are integral emotions more powerful because the thought of your preferred candidate not winning is perceived more as a loss? Yeah, again, I don't have specific data attached to this, but I 100% think that people are more likely to see issues that they have moral convictions about as more zero-sum than not. And I think Tim could probably speak to this as well, in that they're just not really willing to accept any kind of compromise on it. That
which implies that they would see any kind of compromise as some kind of loss. Tim, would you want to chime in on that too?
I'm sorry. Normally I would, but I'm in my back porch and I just got distracted by something. So I apologize for not fully tracking that last bit of the conversation.
Okay, it's just how zero sum are moral convictions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Linda, I've got a quick question while folks think some more. The integral emotion stuff is super interesting and consistent with some data that we have as well. I'm kind of interested what you think in terms of like where to draw the line between constructs, because in some sense, an integral emotion about morality, you could argue is in some sense that is the moral judgment, right? So the fact that making something a moral judgment seem more negative, if you think that moral judgments are inherently effective, then it kind of makes sense, right? So I guess the question is like, do you think it's seen as something separate, or do you think it's more of like you're saying like, hey, just so you know, like this is bad, and a moral judgment just saying this is bad?
Well, except it can also be this is good.
I'm just thinking with your experiment of like the disgusting stimuli, right? Finding a way to make it seem like that attitude topic is bad, I mean, could lend itself to morality because of a kind of like valence overlap. So
yeah, although the interesting thing on that one, Kurt, is that what we did not get effects of or moderation effects on that study was with supporter opposers. Okay, that both supporters of abortion and opposers of abortion increase their moral convictions in that case. They're both getting bad stimuli.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's interesting.
But one would be, kind of undermine their position, and the other one doesn't. So, I'm not sure if this is still again entirely answering your question, but we feel like maybe on the one hand, the reaction was reactance to you're trying to manipulate my feelings about this, whereas the other one like, no, this is bad.
Yeah, that's super interesting that it goes in the direction you had before.
And we had a huge sample size on that one, enormous amounts of power to detect side of issue effects, and it's still kind of mysterious to us that we didn't get them.
Interesting. Frank, we've got maybe 2 more minutes.
Yeah, just a quick question. Thanks so much for your talk, Linda. So I was wondering in this, and I'm sure you might have looked into this in some of your work, but when issues become moralized, how much overlap people's position on that issue is with their overall sense of morality as an individual. So for example, like once it becomes moralized, if I waver, then I lose all my morality if I budge. And also like when you have that overlap, like depending on the positions I signal to others, they might like their perception of my morality will be like fully dependent on what I say, which like I kind of thought of this when you're saying how people would really tiptoe around each other in the moral condition, because it's almost like their whole sense of esteem or kind of worth as a person gets wrapped up in these issues. And I was just curious if you've ever kind of looked in how that might kind of mediate the impact of moralization, that kind of self to stance overlap.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's especially would be an interesting one to explore in those interpersonal exchanges, right? Which we have not done work on specifically identity in those contexts. We do have some unpublished work on identity though, largely because of social identity theorists tend to think that moral convictions must be just a strong reflection of people's social identities, which is a plausible hypothesis, but it doesn't go along very well with people's unwillingness to compromise within group members or the rejection of authorities. And so we've done some work on the degree to which people see their moral convictions as reflections of more of a sense of personal identity, which I think is part of what you're getting at, the sense of moral authenticity. If I were to turn on this one, would I no longer be myself? Versus around issues of in-group loyalty and social identity. And 2 takeaways from that one is that moral convictions appear to be much more about personal identity than social identity, which is consistent, I think, with what your intuitions are. However, the amount of variance explained by either of them is actually pretty small. And really surprisingly, to my mind, surprisingly small, that they're not very much about identity at all. But to the extent they are, they appear to be more about personal than social identity.
Huh, that's really interesting.
Okay, but that's not done in a threatening context, you know, where you could be exposed as being a moral fraud. So this is, you know, putting down ratings yourself anonymously in a, you know, on a questionnaire. I do wonder what it would look like maybe in a more socially accountable situation.
Yeah, kind of like that paradigm you described that in your talk.
Yeah, because it's still striking in terms of the videotapes of those group discussions. People are freaked out. It's like, whoa, I don't know about this.
Very interesting.
All right, so we have a couple questions we didn't get to. Parvathy, I think Linda actually answered your questions. We're answering Frank's questions, so that's good. Brett, sorry, it looks like you're going to share some cool data. Maybe you can email Linda and get her thoughts on that, but it sounds pretty interesting. Everyone else, this is the last talk of the summer series. I'd like to thank you for making it such a success, all the folks who have come. And Linda, on behalf of all the speakers, thank you for showing up and making it so interesting and thoughtful. The future of the center will have more talks, probably not weekly, because you know we're all getting back to our things and hopefully getting back outside and to restaurants and to campus, but we'll still have some events. And right now we have the poster sessions for the summer seminar students, and I'm getting choked up. They're going to be so beautiful. I'm super excited to see those. And I know Nick sent around the link to see those as well. So if you want to hang out and check those out, please do. I will. And otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of the summer. And thanks so much for being a part of the summer talk series. So we'll see you later and stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.